again. Hello again. Welcome. Welcome to the just a second. Okay, I think it's okay now. So welcome again. Welcome to the 7th panel of our series entitled Civil Society Sharing Screen. With this series of panels supported by the European Union, we aim to talk about the main issues concerning the civil society, together with Turkish and international civil society professionals, academics, experts, human rights activists, and of course you, our participants. Well, in the upcoming days, we will organize the last event of this series of panels, but of course, if you would like to watch the previous panels, you can find all the videos on our YouTube channel. Before we start today's event, I have a warm-up question for you. Please share your answers in the chat box. So what comes to your mind when we say the internal dynamics of civil society? Please feel free to write your answers in the chat box. And today's panel is called Civil Society 2.0, Dynamics of Change. We will talk about how the civil society can update itself and what kind of innovative methods the civil society can make use of in terms of its internal functioning, working conditions, and its collaboration with the teams and volunteers. Our moderator will be Mr. Yörük Kurtaran, who has been contributing to the civil society in Turkey for long years. And our speakers are Dilek Ertükel, who is the team leader of the EU-funded civil society project in Turkey called Sivil Düşün. And we have Mauna Bengarga, who is the innovations lead from Civicus. And we have Uygar Özesmi from Change.org. He launched the Change.org in Turkey in 2012, and he is still the general director. Now I'll give the floor to our moderator, Mr. Yörük Kurtaran. Hello, everyone. I hope you are all doing fine. As we have interpretation today, I will try to speak a little bit slow, but I generally tend to speak very fast, so I would like to apologize from our interpreters in advance. And of course, I would like to apologize from those participants following us in English. So we have 3 very valuable speakers with us this evening. And first of all, maybe we can get to know our speakers, and then we can talk about the civil society in Turkey and globally. Are we really making any progress? We can talk about this. How do the civil society organizations position themselves in terms of the changes in the civil society? So first, let's start by introducing our guests. Let's start with Uygar, because he has both a civil society background and academic background. He worked at TEMA, at Greenpeace, at Change.org, and most recently, he is working with Good for Trust. So maybe, Uygar, you can briefly give us some information about Good for Trust, what you are currently doing there, and why are you working in these issues? Maybe in 1 minute, you can just give us some information about it. Yes, the civil society is really transforming and changing. And as the civil society changes, the way we do business is also changing. I started mainly working in the field of social enterprises. This includes civil society approach, but it brings together the civil society with the business world. And at Good for Trust, we mainly work on fair production, fair trades, and we come together with people called prosumers, as we call them, and we try to come up with a new economy, prosumer economy, as we call it. So it's a new type of economic system that we're trying to create, actually. And this is, in a way, a system just like a forest. And we have everyone working in solidarity, but it's also totally friendly to the environment. It's a new ecological system emerging together with the civil actors. That's what we're trying to do. Okay, wonderful, great. Thank you, Uygar. So let me introduce our second guest, Mona Bengarga. She worked for Oxfam, and as I'm also interested in youth policies, I'm interested in the work in Africa. She worked a lot in Africa as well. And for the last 5 years, she has been working at Civicus. So maybe, Mona, you can talk about your activities at Civicus for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so honored, and it's a pleasure to be with you in this nice afternoon for me, and I think it's getting late in Turkey. So I'm Monet, I'm the innovation lead at Civicus. Civicus is the Global Alliance for Citizen Participation. We've been working around, many subjects, but mainly to the challenges to civic space and consolidating and supporting civil society in its transformative formats around the world. We work in many areas, either to defend human rights organizations, civic space, civil society organizations, also to build more alliances and networks and collaboration, because we believe that it is really important that we come together at the regional, national, and more specifically at the global level, using and exploring more mechanisms to support each other on these different contexts, especially now after the pandemic, if we can say after, actually during the pandemic, and it doesn't look that it's going anywhere. And also we've been working in pushing more innovation and more effectiveness and accountability on civil society, specifically on the internal dynamics that was mentioned as an important area today that we will go more further for. I cannot, talk a lot in this intro to keep a more interesting point to the conversation, but I invite you to explore more about Civicus. We have a lot of resources that can benefit all of you. And thank you so much again for the invitation.
Well, thank you indeed, Mona, for being with us. And our final speaker today will be Dilek Ertuğal. Since 1990s, she has been working for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, Amnesty International, NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and most recently she has been working at Civil Düşün. Maybe she won't remember, but I have a memory with her from 20 years ago. We were organizing a workshop at Bilgi University, and she attended that workshop and she said something that I still remember. She said, if you don't ask for money, people will never give you the money, because that was a workshop on fundraising. And I still remember what she said, because we've been talking about fundraising and the civil society and transforming civil society. So she said, if you don't ask for it, you will not get it. So I always remember that. So Dilek, maybe you can talk about Civil Düşün program. Thank you and welcome.
Well, Yörük, you have honored me in a big, big way to have someone of your experience and incredible generosity remember something that I said. It's fantastic. So it seems like even our little words, little things make a difference, don't they? They really do. So thank you. I have a very fond memory of that workshop as well. There are many of you who are friends of after many years of working in Turkey, so I say hello and selam, and I thank Hrant Dink Vakfı for this invitation. It's my first time having the chance to work with you, so I'm really, really honored. I have the privilege of leading Civil Düşün, which, as many of you know, is an innovative tool created by and operated by the European Union, and it's designed basically to provide quick and flexible support to small-scale civil society initiatives, rights-based initiatives all over the country. And so we see ourselves as a source of in-kind support, but also a source of inspiration and information and networking through all of our various activities. I have to say that although we live in a world of shrinking space, what keeps me very excited and optimistic and motivated is to see how many people all across the country, activists and civic organizations alike, who are coming forward and wanting to take some sort of action, to do some sort of activity that will help improve rights. Out of the close to 700 organizations and activists we've supported just in the last 18 months, interestingly, 80% of them are brand new to Civic Duchen, and 35% of them are activists. So it really speaks to an energy that's out there in civil society in Turkey, and very, very encouraging. So again, thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues and answering questions.
Great. Then I will start by asking a question to Uygar. Uygar, if it's okay with you. We have these buzzwords, right? Like globalization or the technological developments. The pandemic now is a part of our lives, accelerating certain processes and transforming and changing things. So with or without the pandemic, in a way, we see certain barriers and borders being removed. Even to find a vaccine, certain people had to open up their data banks and other people were using their information. But because of the pandemic, although we have passports, we cannot travel anymore. So on one hand, we see the borders and barriers being removed, but on the other hand, we see the emergence of new barriers and new borders. That's the trend. And on the other hand, the civil society faced with these complex issues is trying to find new ways of working. For instance, you are also involved in technological activities. So we have the blockchain technology, for instance. I think it's going to totally change everything. Maybe in 20 years, we will be talking about totally different things, but we have shared economy, we have organizations with no legal entities. So the civil society is also trying to adopt itself through new methods. So from that perspective, Uygar, and based on your experience with change.org or this shared economy network, do you really think that we can talk about a transformation in the way the civil society engages with these issues or is involved in these issues? So can you also talk about some opportunities and threats regarding this whole issue of transformation? Well, of course, I'll be glad to talk about these issues. The pandemic totally changed the online environment, the digital environment. We did not see this change only in the field of communication, but of course, the civil society organizations started to prefer digital environments in their communications. They are using more and more the digital platforms. We've all been there. We've gone through that, and we have all been involved in this change. And people are also using the digital environments more and more. For instance, during the pandemic, the activities of campaigns on change.org increased by 4-fold. So people launching campaigns at change.org or supporting some campaigns on our platform increased incredibly during the pandemic. And it's only very recent that, by the way, Muna was asking, can we really talk about after the pandemic, because we're still going through the pandemic? We can say, at least for our own platform, that we are now back we are now following the trends after the pandemic in terms of digital activism. We are now back to the pre-pandemic levels in terms of engagement and numbers. So as we have this huge shift to the digital platforms, we are seeing the ramifications of this in other fields as well, just like in business and trade. But there is something very interesting about business. For social enterprises, the trade volume, when looking at the Good for Trust initiative, for instance, there is a difference. If we compare the social enterprises with commercial enterprises, we can say that social enterprises increased by 3-fold compared to commercial enterprises. Because during the pandemic, something happened to people. It revealed something in terms of injustices or social problems, inequalities. It was an eye-opener for people. People came to realize that things cannot continue like this. So people are now opting for alternative economic models. And we are also seeing this at our platform. And this was a good indicator of this change or this transformation. So you mentioned the blockchain technology. Currently, we still cannot say that the civil society is widely using blockchain technology. It's only used as a payment system by certain humanitarian assistance organizations, and some humanitarian assistance or aid organizations are trying to secure the documentation of certain transactions through the blockchain technology. And what we also observe is that in the supply chains, you can also follow a product to see if it's a fair trade product or not. So blockchain technologies also help us to go to the source of the products. And there is also maybe the dark side of this change. We have more and more surveillance. We call it the surveillance capitalism. So the states, the governments are now following up on the civil society organizations more and more. They can profile them. There is an increase for government surveillance over civil society organizations. So I think our representative from Civicus will talk about it, so I will not go into the details. So another dark side was that together with digitalization, false information or wrong information that would be detrimental to the civil society organizations is also now spreading widely. This is like a propaganda against the civil society organizations, but we also have movements against these propaganda actions. We have more social control mechanisms coming into play, and civil society organizations are very active. So you said you talk very fast, but I think I'm also speaking very fast. I would like to apologize from our interpreters because I think I was speaking very fast. So over to you, Yörük, and I hope I have been able to answer your question.
In fact, that's great. And you are now handing it over to Mona in this way. So let me just ask this question to Mona. So along with the pandemic, we have seen a lot of change. But even before the pandemic, we have been discussing this issue of shrinking civic space. So this has been a phenomenon even before the pandemic. And in Turkey, we always tend to think that the shrinking civic space is a problem in Turkey, but it is, of course, not the case. It is also a problem elsewhere. So I'm curious about Mona's take on this. Considering Civicus and its activities in the current civic space, and of course, governments may intervene or respond in certain ways. There are certain states who are in fact shrinking the civic space themselves. So against this backdrop, where do you see the trends in this civic space, Mona? What is your take on this issue? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a really important question for a couple of reasons. That we start only looking to the shrinking of civic space sometimes in the time of crisis, or only on a national level where there is a crackdown on freedom of peaceful assembly or journalism, control, surveillance, and censorship. And unfortunately, this was the trend, for 20 years now, if it's not more. But we start paying more attention to it when it starts to also be manifested and duplicated the same tactics by different governments. And this is where I think the shrinking space or the subject of civic space is becoming a global challenge for civil society at the international level, at the regional, and also at the national level. And just the term of civic space in itself, it's not familiar to many people, and fortunately and unfortunately, we use it a lot in our setting as a professional to express actually that people are not free to express their opinions, to mobilize, to hold their government accountable, to ask questions. And sometimes people, they don't see the connection with the shrinking of civic space and their well-being and their economic situation, social development, because there is unfortunately, government succeeded in putting the human rights agenda as a margin agenda, as an agenda that's not linked directly to the economic situation or social situation, unfortunately. And the pandemic really showed that this narrative of making the freedom of peaceful assembly, for example, as part of the areas where government used to shrink the civic space, it's looked at as a disruptive, ways of holding the government accountable, or it's not a welcomed, process or a welcomed manifestation for the people. What is also really clear that the pandemic increased the crackdown on civic space, on people freedoms, and especially with the movements. And I'm again emphasizing on the movements because it was the primary response from people responding to the restrictions and to the measurements that the government put to respond to the pandemic, that most of the time they marginalize a big portion or a big part of the population. And also it puts, and we talk about digitalization, it puts the people in a less, in more vulnerable situation, especially in the access to a primary services such as health, education. And population and citizen only found the streets are their way to express the frustration and the demand that was met by police violence all over the world, from India to Philippines, to other countries in Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tunisia, Algeria. So there is this usual way of shutting down people. But it was what is most interesting in this conversation about shrinking of civic space was also it's not unusual, but the crackdown on journalism and journalists and media organizations or independent media. Let me be specific. It's independent media that was threatened through this process of the pandemic or this period of the pandemic, where we see again the internet censorship, the social media surveillance that is happening from authoritarian regimes, such as Russia, China, and it's becoming really clear that journalists or journalism represent a strong pillar that can help in pushing a different narrative about civil society. The third part was the disinformation, and here I will talk more about the digital space. Also, unfortunately, the shrinking of civic space is not happening only on the ground. So, before we were saying that it is true that the physical space is shrinking, but at least we have the digital space. So we can mobilize, we can discuss there, we can create a different narrative about what is already in the government media or on the owned government, mechanisms. So digital space is becoming high controlled, and that's why the transformation that we've been talking about is really slow in responding to the threats on digital space that is faced by the civil society organization. And the restriction is the one and primary is the disinformation. The disinformation that is touch many areas. In fact, one of them is civil society reputation. So now, especially formed, more organized, structured civil society face a wave of campaigns, misinformation campaigns about their involvement, about their attentions, about their background, about why they are calling government to be accountable for X, Y, and Z. The second is disinformation about the whole human rights agenda, and you see the wave of dehumanizing the LGBTQI movements around the world, and that is really important, to look at, especially on digital spaces, where it really sometimes take a more violent, manifestation on the ground. And to close, even with these all challenges on the closing of civic space, we see civil society responded differently. So civil society was the first to respond on the ground to the issues of the pandemic, and this has really positioned CSOs and NGOs and movements and artists and creative communities in the core of the change that we want to have in the future, or to adjust to the response of the pandemic. We published recently, at the beginning of this year, an overview of the response of civil society to the pandemic. And it gives you concrete example from Uganda to Argentina about how civil society mobilized to support the citizens, to support each other, to support even the government, especially by switching to become more a service delivery, but also on the accountability level, requesting for better equal access to vaccines, to food supplies, to healthcare, and to education for the most vulnerable and marginalized people. So I hope, I gave an overview and I respond to the question, but I'm happy if there is any follow-up.
Thank you very much, Mona. Uygar has, of course, talked about his own experience and also shared his anecdotes from change.org. He also offered us a global perspective. And now I would like to give the floor to Dilek once again, because Sivil Düşün program, this EU-funded program, has been going on in Turkey for a long time. And it's one of the most prominent program in the sense that it does not only offer funding, financial resources, but it also offers other types of opportunities for civil society. So let me turn to you, Dilek, right now. How do you see the civil society organizations in Turkey or elsewhere around the world? And I want to ask this question because, in fact, civil society is, in fact, the sum of all organizations, but also initiatives around the globe. So from the perspective of Sivil Düşün, how do you observe the change?
Thank you, York. I'm instinctively an optimistic person, so I am always looking for rays of sunshine. So I'm not going to emphasize what's bad. I'm going to try to focus on what I think is exciting and that gives me a lot of hope for where we're going in the future. One is I'd like to say that the whole experience of, we receive requests for support from all over the country in the thousands. And what you sense, what I get from that is that as I said before, there's a lot of energy, despite the fact that the space is shrinking, despite the fact that there's more pressure, more surveillance. The work is risky. The fact is that people care about their communities, their families, their friends, their colleagues, the people that they work with, and they want to improve. They want things to improve for the better. And that's why they are taking these steps to come to Civic and say, hey, I have this idea and I'd like to try this out. So you see a lot of experimentation going on. As I said in my opening remarks, the fact that 80% of these, the folks that are coming to Civic are brand new. I mean, this is a program that's about to celebrate its 10th year next year. So 80% are brand new. So that says that there are constantly people who are coming to the realization that they want to be part of civil society, either as formal organizations or as individuals, and want to do something to improve, what's going on in the country on a whole range of issues. We see that the areas where people are focused on are very much mirror the prominent rights-based issues in Turkey today. So concern for women and gender is at the top of the list. Children at the top of the list. Culture, cultural rights, environment is top of the line. Education rights are at top of the line. So you see that civil society is working in parallel. When in May of last year, when the epidemic hit, we created a special law and offered support to activists and organizations interested in and wanting to support people who were particularly vulnerable, whose rights were particularly vulnerable in the during the pandemic. And we saw a huge increase in the number of requests coming from people working for labor rights, because the pandemic really showed us how fragile the rights of people are who are at the front line. And so there was a lot of effort to support that. We saw a lot of work going into health rights to ensure that, people were able to access health care and information. So what I see is a civil society that is energized. I see a civil society that is not giving up. I see a civil society that is very relevant and responsive to the issues that are upcoming. In the last quarter, of course, our support a lot of requests have come on the environment because of the devastating fires and floods. We see people are very concerned about climate change. And I think the other trend that I would like to share is that there's a lot of local activity going on. So people are focused on their communities, their neighborhoods, in small clusters. They are trying to make a change where they live and with the immediate environment of where they work. And I think that's all very, very encouraging. Of course, the other trend that I notice is that everyone is using technology. We are forced to. We have to. And I think, in crises and in change, there are always some good things that come out of it. We probably may not have been utilizing this Zoom tool today, talking as frequently as we are today. I mean, it's very exciting to see how many more programs are available all over the country, produced by all kinds of organizations. Being able to know what's going on in civil society and the issues that we're concerned about and how we're trying to address them, it's so much easier now to learn about that and make connections through that, because we're all using this technology to share our work. So I hope that that's answered your question, Jörg.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm also one of the founders of Support Foundation for Civil Society, which you have already raised is what we have also observed in the beneficiaries who apply to our grant schemes. Among others, we have also observed how institutions build a certain relation with these problems because the problems evolve over time. They become multi-layered. And on the other hand, these institutions or CSOs, they are also transforming within the organization. So this is not only to do with the pandemic. That's why I wanted to bring it up. So it is not only an external transformation, but there is also an internal transformation. Let me give you an example. It's pandemic related. We always ask our, young office workers so that they would help us with the photocopy errands. But in fact, now it is the same person, same office boy who helps us deal with the major problems that the pandemic posed to us. Because civil society organizations are also institutionalized or structured with a certain age hierarchy. And young people, they are very good in technology. So this dynamic is also changing. So here is my question to you, Uygar. From your perspective, do you see a change within the organizations, within CSOs? Because some of CSOs are more conventional. They want to have a board of directors. Of course, this is not a bad practice. They may continue their activities in this way. But on the other hand, there are some others who are making an effort to come up with something different. They see the current way of managing their organizations problematic and they want to think out of the box. So what is your take on this?
Well, of course, I can talk about the field of technology because for the last 10 years, I've been working with institutions that are active in the field of technology. And the major characteristics that I can observe is that these institutions actually mainly appeal young people. So these are institutions and organizations that mainly work with young people. And I am an exception here as a relatively senior person working in our organization. For instance, at goodfortrust.org, we have a sociocratic organization. In the sociocratic system, you might look it up to see what it is. We have circles of organization. We no longer have these traditional hierarchies. Everything is based on people's functions, fields of interest, and it's all about fulfilling your own potential. So that's basically a type of organization based on people's skills and interests. So, as I mentioned, it's mainly young people who are easily able to show themselves in these fields. So we now have younger organizations being created because they employ young people. But we shall not forget that those young organizations will eventually get old and they will also transform into other organizations. And there is this constant change and transformation within the society anyway. But despite this, I can say that even young people during this period are questioning the existing power hierarchies. They are questioning everything. Young people are no longer sitting where they are, or they are not accepting this gerontocratic hierarchy anymore. They no longer want to be a part of this power system. They are questioning these power relations and they want to come up with alternatives. They want to find alternatives and create alternatives to the existing systems. So in terms of diversity and inclusion, most recently, I can say that in all the organizations I work for, in our board of directors and the other organizations that I work for, we are now creating new units or departments. We now have more diverse and inclusive structures that people are trying to create. That's what I can observe as a change. Another change or transformation that I can observe within the organizations is that this existing toxic code of ethics, work ethics is changing. When I was young, for instance, people would just work so hard and it was actually the right thing to do, to work so hard, give everything you have to your work, devote yourself fully. But now young people are different. They realized something. Now we're talking about well-being. So well-being is more important nowadays. People also, the employers also pay attention to the well-being of their employees. So overworking is prevented. People are provided with special breaks. Even the working days, weekly working days are being reduced to 4 days a week. So we're talking about new systems. For instance, I can talk about what's happening at change.org Turkey. For instance, 80% of our employees are not working full-time, but they are working only 4 days a week or even less. And they spend the rest of their times further developing themselves, trying to find ways to contribute to the society, civil society. Well, they are actually working for the civil society as paid employees, but in their free time, they also try to make a contribution to the civil society in other ways. So I think this is a change brought about by the pandemic, but this was already coming even before the pandemic. So in terms of business ethics, now there is a shift, things are changing. And if you ask me, it's changing for the best, for the good. And these are the changes that I can observe regarding internal dynamics. Yes, Uygar, you made a lot of reference to young people, and Mauna has a background of working with young people. So let me ask you, Mauna, is that really the case? Is what Uygar telling us true from your perspective? Can you tell us, based on your work at Civicus and based on your background, can you share your experience about how young people are triggering or not triggering change at the organization? So would you like to give us some information about that?
Yeah, sure. And actually, I'm excited that we are taking also like a more close look to the youth contribution to civil society. Yes, it is true. And I think this is relevant to every young generation in its own society. So even like maybe 30 years ago, the young generation brought like a different aspect to civil society, to their, to their environment. And maybe what is different in our era is the digital space. So we feel, it's become more evident that youth have a better connection with others. They can establish more understanding, to the issues, and that through creative ways of dialogue, of expressions. You see the rise of artists. There are most of them young people, either through graffitis or through hip hop, through rap, which is touched directly a different generation that traditional civil society did not fail to reach out to, but I think we're not equipped, or traditional civil society, it's not equipped to reach to that type of population where we touch the core and we connect with them directly. So young people really have that capacity, in addition to the digital maneuver. Like they know the space from TikTok. I think now I'm really outdated when I talk about Facebook or Twitter, because now we are in another era of TikTok. I think like singing groups from Korea that really influencing how we look, to climate change and how we look to rising of authoritarian regimes around the world. So young people are doing that. But if you ask me on the traditional level and more structures, organizations, I think that we are still struggling for the inclusion of youth and other, groups that historically they were not really looked at to create, to be in the structure of civil society. And why we are struggling? Because unfortunately, we are still sometimes dealing with the founder syndromes. So it is really hard to let go of the creation that we did. And now I'm talking internally to civil society, where the efficiency, the innovation, and the accountability are becoming more important to fight the disinformation, to fight the campaigns of reputation that civil society are really facing. And this founder syndromes is coming from different aspects. One, the expertise. So, old leaders or current leaders of institutional structure, civil society, things they hold enough understanding of the policy making of the government, which is true. But youth hold the key and other groups hold the key for connections, for more inclusion, for mobilization. And we see the example, for example, in Tunisia, where the Union of Workers really does a good job in mobilizing a certain category of people. But it really fails in mobilizing young people. And then you see movements and in-structure movements that they are making more effort in reaching out, and actually they are more successful in mobilizing different categories of citizens to mobilize around certain areas. I want to go back to the issue of accountability. And I think it's really important because it links to to the openness to other groups. And I know I'm moving, from the youth to another issue, but I think it's really important to talk about accountability here in civil society. One of the weaknesses or the threats that is our understanding and start to have a real constituent relation. And why I think that is a weakness, because social movements are now, they are going through this protest cycle. So every protest, every movement has a cycle, and the demands of people are not met because there is no that formality that reach to the decision makers. Formal civil society or traditional civil society has that capacity because they understand the policy-making space. But this connection between the constituents with can mobilize through movements, and we see in all the occasions that people who are leading movements are not civil society activists. You don't know them. Their names were never in media before. These are like, students or professors or like a nurse in one hospital that succeeded to mobilize people around issues. And one example is the Women's March, and how it started, and now it's becoming this global movement to demand more women's rights. So, and this go back to the accountability, because that relation of constituents is really important to keep civil society accountable to the constituents that they are, working with, even if they choose to mobilize through different formats such as movement mobilization. I hope this point is clear, but I'm really we're seeing a lot of gaps on the accountability level that is undermining a lot of the efforts of civil society, because it's becoming really easy to attack through being a foreign agent, holding a different agenda. Even when we discuss poverty and marginalized population and in rural area, somehow governments find a way to change the narrative to becomes a narrative of a counter narrative about the intentions of mentioning these issues more than to solve these issues. And thank you.
Well, Mr. Mehmet has a question. So I'll ask a question to Dilek. Maybe after this round, Uygar, you can answer that question in the chat box. So Dilek was talking about new types of organizations, and she said that's what they're doing at Sivil Düşün program. And Mauna and Uygar, they talked about young people, and they made an emphasis on the impact of young people. And my personal observation is that, yes, from one perspective, we can say that certain young people have their own organizations. I'll call it an organization because sometimes they have legal entities, sometimes they don't have legal entities. But what I can observe is that those people who are involved in more traditional organizations are now also shifting to other types of organizations where they are more able to do what they want to do, or they're able to do the things that they weren't able to do in those large structures, big organizations. So yes, young people are important, but I believe that there are also people who cannot breathe, who cannot do anything within the traditional organizations, but who have a certain level of expertise, and they also try to come together with people who share a similar perspective with them, and they come up with new organizations that include young people as well. But these organizations include people from my generation. I'm 47 years old, so I think I am a more senior person now. So there is also this trend, and the way these people work with regards to decision-making processes, etc., is different. So concerning Sivil Düşün program and with regards to the organizations you communicate with, what is the difference in terms of the way you work? Dilek, I would like to ask you this because it's a very different thing. You are working with many organizations from very different backgrounds. How do you do that?
Well, I just want to share a few observations connected with all the questions, all the comments that everyone made. Hearing Uygar talk about experimenting with different organizational forms, I think that's very exciting, and that's something that I think we need to infuse the sector in Turkey with more of that kind of thinking, because what I see is that there's a lot of conversation about kurumsallaşma, about institutionalization. There's a recognition that, something just isn't working, but not necessarily knowing where to go and how to do this. So I think seeing more models, having more conversations about the ways we can actually structure and organize ourselves. What are the alternatives? What are the positives and the negatives would be extremely healthy. One of the things it's interesting, I'm 63 years old, and I'm of a generation, where the human rights movement was still new. And so we lived in a world where we were just always focusing on how bad it is and how terrible it is and blaming people and trying to hold everyone accountable, and mostly spending a lot of energy trying to make people aware of their rights. And sometimes we don't realize that the work that we did made a difference. So what I see is, particularly in Turkey, I was born here, but I was raised in the United States. I came back to Turkey 20 years ago. And what I witnessed 20 years ago, what I see now is a huge sea change. And there's a tension between the older and the younger. The younger generation does not see itself as victims of human rights. They see themselves as people with rights who are empowered, and they want to do something with their rights. this is, whenever I say this, I get chills because I think this is where we need to be. So all the effort that went into helping people become aware of their rights, the whole European Union project itself, I think what that's done is it's helped bring forward a new, I don't want to call necessarily, it's not just younger people, but it's definitely people younger than me who see themselves as empowered, and they want to say, okay, I want to use the power to fix something. That's something that I observe. You see it in the way that people communicate their projects, the way that they interact in workshops, the kinds of questions they ask, and how they interact with each other. What that's doing is that's forcing the older generation of leaders and organizations to also shift because the language has changed. The ways of interacting has changed. Younger people use humor. They speak in shorter sentences. And as a result, they get farther with that. And so it's forcing those of us who've lived kind of in this intellectual, theoretical world to throw all that out and speak simply and speak with humor and metaphor and feeling, all of which is very, very motivating. And I think that is what I feel, that civil society is being infused by this younger generation of people. I think that what's interesting about this conversation about structures, horizontal, vertical, that there's always been this great tension. Everyone is against hierarchy and very much for horizontal in at least in the rights-based community. That's, a common point of conversation. And there's a real issue with leadership, with the word leader. All organizations, all movements, whether they're formal or informal, need some way of making decisions, some way of delegating, because a person cannot do everything. We have to share the responsibility just to get the tasks done. And there's some people who are really good at one thing and others are better at something else. So how do we create structures that take into account the skills and the interests of the people we work with, whether they're old or they're young, and involve them in the work that we do? How do we keep our organizations fresh? I worked for years and years in politics in the United States. And one of the great things about working in politics, I worked with a political organization that was electing women to high office. And one of the great things about elections is that every 2 years, there would be the start of a new election cycle, a new opportunity to elect more women to the United States Congress. So at the end of every election year, we would all come together and we'd say, what did we learn? What did we do well? What did we not do well? What's on the horizon? And how do we reorganize ourselves, if necessary, to meet the challenges and take advantage of the lessons that we learned? I think that's what we really need in Turkey and in civil society all around the world. We cannot afford to be static entities. If we're static, we're not relevant. We're not responding to the changes in the people that we work with. We're not going to be able to respond to the trends in the world. So I think what we need is a focus on how do we build adaptivity? How do we focus on strategy? How do we create different structures that take into consideration other people's talents and bring them all together, whether it's in a formal structure, a network, a fast reaction to something, or something that we're trying to build over time. That's what I see. And I think the reason why we're seeing so many new entities come forward is because a lot of people don't feel that the older organizations have space for them, that are welcoming to them. It may not necessarily be a good thing that we're always creating something new. You know how they always say going back to Turkish history that, you always have to get rid of the old guys to start the new thing. That's also not a good practice. There's lots of lessons we can learn from the old, but we ought not to be static, and we ought not to be so wed to a way of doing things. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much indeed. Before I proceed to the last round of questions, I can see a question by Mehmet in the chat box addressed to Uygar Özesmi. Uygar, would you like to respond to Mehmet's question? And then we will proceed with another one for all our speakers. Yes, with great pleasure. In fact, I attach great importance to this question. Active citizenship. When we talk about civil society, what lies behind it? It is active citizens coming together, people coming together, speaking out, making their voices heard. And of course, civil society and also the digital platforms are one of the most important ways of doing this, and signature campaigns are in fact one of the most ancient tools. We even see that in the ancient Egypt, used by people when they wanted to rise against the pharaoh. So I think this is the very essence of civil society, active citizenship. So you are standing out with courage. We need to understand this first. You need to dare to speak. Of course, we can always accept those who do not dare to speak or who do not dare to put their signature under a campaign. However, when it comes to those who dare to speak out, who put their signature under a certain campaign, these are in fact people who feel this as their mission, as their duty to transform and lead that change. Having said that, change.org does not share by any means data of its signatories or profile information of its signatories. Of course, we already have the law on general data protection as well as GDPR. Change.org website works in full compliance with the GDPR too. So this is out of question for us. That said, what we are trying to do is, of course, to publicly share certain issues which we believe that there should be a public debate. For instance, if there is an increase in the signatories of a certain campaign which deals with persecution of a certain group, then we provide reports drawn from open data and we share those publicly. And we do this so that we can shed our light on this issue as civil society, and so that we can bring about change and achieve that transformation. So we see this as our civic duty. We see this as our civic duty, as a citizen duty. If it's not us, it will be, of course, marketing companies doing that. Thank you. So if anyone has any question about that, please have a look at the disclaimers and information notes on the website of change.org. Yes, time flows in the meantime. And yes, we also discussed the pandemic, which has an important impact on all these matters. But let me tell you the lesson that I learned throughout this process. perhaps you can share the trends that you have started to observe during this process. But here is what I observed. In civil society, of course, we always need to support projects. And in recent years, I've been involved in the Support Foundation for Civil Society. And based on this experience, I can tell that organizations and the actual process of getting organized is far more important than projects. So we should offer our support to organizations as such. And another observation I have is that the way of organizing is far more important than the organizations themselves. So in other words, we need to be very quick in adapting ourselves to newly emerging situations, because this is how we, in fact, build relationship, how we make connections and build an organization. You are joining a community, doing things together in that community, or sometimes you prefer to act alone by yourself. So I believe the state of organizing or the way of organizing will become more prominent in our daily lives with the evolving and advancing technology. So this is one of the key lessons that I learned in this process. And here's another thing. We are living in such times where tomorrow is rather gray, because we would either think of a black or white future. In other words, a bright future or not a promising future. But now I think it's in the gray zone. The future is not so obvious. It is ambiguous. So let me ask it to our speakers. Based on your conversations with your stakeholders, what are the lessons you have learned? And maybe your conversations can also inform us on where civil society is headed. So let me first start with Dilek. What are the lessons that you learned in this process?
What I have learned is that people are very, I think they get it. I think they get what you just said, that, you know, the future is very ambiguous. Although I was always told when I first came back to Turkey that, you know, Turks are very accustomed to living in uncertainty, and that's true. We are, as a people, you know, in a way, very adaptable. We don't expect predictability. We don't expect stability because it's something that's eluded us. But I think, you know, civil society organizations are very aware of this now, and I think there is a growing curiosity about how to use technology. And I think one of where the efforts are mostly used, you know, I think social media is seen as a main vehicle for communicating and raising awareness. But we haven't necessarily figured out yet among the civil society organizations in Turkey how to use technology to create a sustained level of participation. How do we use the technologies not just in a, you know, response to a crisis? I mean, I think this is the mechanism that change.org gives us, right, is an opportunity to respond to a crisis. How do we take that response of those people who have signed those petitions and deepen their involvement in our work? And I think that is a conversation we still have to have. That's a conversation that that's an area that for 20 years civil society in Turkey has struggled with, because we are not very good yet at involving people in our work. And I think as a result of that, because we're not able to build a following, so certainly the digital tools are helping us do that, we don't have the power that we need to have to create the change. We are still seen as marginalized. So, when elected officials can sort of attack on a women's issue because they have more women voters than we have women members in our organizations. So I think we have to focus on how do we use the technology to engage people, create a sense of belonging, help empower those citizens, as Uygar was saying, to be active in their own communities, in their own workspaces, in their neighborhoods, or wherever. I couldn't agree with you more, Jurek, on this issue of projects versus ways of organizing. I think that is also, again, key. We have been relying on a lot of tools that don't work anymore as well as they used to. And so we have to be adaptive and creating and finding new innovations. What's interesting is this trend now in Turkey, this interest in the whole field of social innovation. We're seeing a lot of activists and new formulations who characterize themselves as social innovators. And so their whole sort of focus is how do we solve a problem using technology? So it's not just about how do we raise awareness, but how do we solve that problem? There is I think, a little bit of a disconnect, can be a little bit of a disconnect between the people who are sort of gravitating to social innovation and sort of the world of civic work. And so I think, we need to infuse each other, bring each other closer together. And I think there's a lot of room for people who are really interested in helping civil society develop this technological capability. I think we need that help. I'm not a technology person, but there's so many people now who have come out of that field around the world and in Turkey. And I think civil society organizations could really benefit from an increase in the number of people who are prepared to help us build that capacity. Those are the lessons. Those are the things that made me think. I think the other thing that that has made me think a lot in this period is about interconnectivity. The pandemic has shown us that we're all vulnerable. There isn't anybody who's not vulnerable to this thing, COVID-19. And a lot of the problems on climate change, we realized, these are issues that do not recognize borders. And so, and they affect civil society, they affect business, they affect academia, they affect women, men. So I think there is a need increasingly for us to look at how we solve our local problems in an interconnected way with our neighbors. For example, the issue facing the Marmara Deniz is not just about, what flows from industry or from the municipalities into the water. It has to do with the Danube and coming from the Black Sea. So we have to work with each other in order to solve these problems. And so I think this interconnectivity also this situation has made me think a lot about interconnectivity, working across sectors, working across issues.
Your thoughts reminded me of something else. So I'm now speaking loud. Certain segment of civil society, perhaps rightfully so, they always have this hate relationship of the business community. So they loathe the business community, in other words. So perhaps we should be talking about civil society making peace with white collars I mean, of course, we can always discuss if such coming to terms with will be realistic. But I have learned very important lessons during the pandemic about the need for civil society making peace with business community. Let me turn to Mona. You are working at Civicus. You are extracting data from a number of countries. You are reviewing all the data compiled. What are the lessons you have learned?
Yeah, thank you so much, Yorick. Actually, the first one is to build on what you are saying, is building alliances. And I know the terms in itself, it can be vague. But in our, in our work, it's become really clear that even there is resistance from the traditional old civil society, young and more juvenized organizations are willing to work not with the business sector per se, but with social entrepreneurs, with creative communities, with artists, with like different actors. So that interconnectivity that Dawak was talking about, it is also related to building these alliances, these communities that bring different, actors, different people. And it's becoming more important not only to build them on the national level, but also at the regional level. And this is what sometimes that we are really behind, while the data is telling us that governments are learning from each other on terms of restrictions, on terms of policy making. You see what happened in the pandemic. In some countries, it was copy-paste from other countries' responses. But civil society, our, actors in the civic space, because we're not the only one there, also social entrepreneurs are there, business with social agenda also are there. We're not responding the same. We are still working in silos. We are still thinking about what will happen if we will work together, what will be the consequences, and if we will agree or not. The cause is urgent. The cause of working together cannot wait for another decade or 2 or 3. And I think we need, from our place, to enhance this collaboration. It is true that our agenda with businesses are different. And unfortunately, businesses or social enterprises will never replace civil society. Our role is purely social, is purely human rights, is purely dedicated to the citizens that we are working with. And I think from that perspective, we need to get into these alliances and collaboration because we bring in different perspective. Another important also lesson learned, digital space and digitalization and this like huge sector there with social media are important, but we should not leave anyone behind. The digital divide is true. And it's real, and it's impacting people. So we cannot rely a lot on digital spaces, and we need to be really conscious that digital space is limited in itself. And we cannot live in our bubble of how we look on digital space, especially with the algorithm, with all these, these technologies that sometimes is really is shadowing the reality. It does not let us really look to the reality in itself. So this is the second one. And third, which I think is really, it's really, it's becoming more and more clear. There is a trend to not to kill, but to oppress any voices that are requesting accountability and transparency around the world. So this is not a global South issue. This is even a global North issue. And maybe the difference is the tactics. In the global North, there is, maybe other mechanisms, to shut down voices and protest. And you saw what happened with the Black Lives Matters movement and all the challenge that happened there in the US that triggered a whole conversation about racial justice around the world and not only the US. So what is becoming more clear that the independent voices, even in digital space, are becoming more bothering. They bother. And I think this is where we need to work, is like to enhance, to raise awareness, to come together to create solution, because I think people and normal citizens are a little bit fed up from just the big titles that civil society is creating. But what we showed in the pandemic, that we can be solution oriented and touch directly the life of the people outside the project mentality. And one last thing that I've been thinking about it is the donors community role. Really, we cannot keep working this way. We can't. Like, if we need system change, and this is what we need, not project-based interventions. We need system change. Donor has to change their ways of working. And actually, this is impacting our even internal system. Why we have all this hierarchy is to accommodate reports, to accommodate financial requirement and compliances. And this should not be against the accountability level that I've been talking about, but we need also to become more innovative about what doesn't mean accountability for us and with our donors. And donors has to be educated to change their behavior as well. So those are my 4 now. It's not 3. I was hoping to have only 3. Thank you.
Mona, your last statements, very important actually, because we call it giving it all to the donors, because donors have certain needs, civil society organizations have certain needs, but it's all about how we can manage this. And it's all about how we can change that mentality or the mentality of the donors. So we shouldn't just say yes to whatever the donors say, but we need to make 2 steps forward so that they will approach us also 2 steps maybe. So we need to think about these things. And Uygar, would you like to add something? Well, we've heard very inspiring statements from Dilek, from Mona, and from you also, Yörük, this way of organizing and the need to get organized. I totally agree with what you have said. The change will happen only if we can get organized, if we can unite our forces. And as Dilek said, we need to deepen that and we need to transform that into real social change. Of course, apart from getting organized, there is another rising trend, which is the issue of ethics and ethical behavior. We also have to think about this, I believe. It should be a part of our agendas, I believe, because as you said, white-collar employees are now working much closer with civil society organizations, and it's only because of ethics, because they're questioning the ethics of their companies. They are asking themselves, my company, the company I'm working for, is this company causing global climate change? Is this company abusing people? Is my company respectful of people's rights, for instance? They are asking these questions. And is my company seeing people as clients or consumers? Is my company defending individualism or collectivism? Does the company defend the society, social movements? So these are the things that people are questioning. White-collar people are questioning. So when they ask these questions, when they question these things, 2 things happen. One is that they actually get closer to the civil society organizations. They do volunteering. They become part of civil society activities, and they also work for the emergence of new civil society organizations. And as enlightened white-collar employees, they start to be become a part of that change. And the second thing is that they can also create change and transformation within their own companies. They say, my company should also work like a civil society organization to pursue a goal, a social benefit. So they convert this into an activism. So again, we have to talk about active citizenship here. So these white collar people transform into activists, and they also trigger the transformation within their companies, because civil society means active citizens. So when active citizens come together under a legal entity, we call it a civil society organization. If it's a non-legal entity, then it's not even an informal civil society institution. It's just organizing. But if people are mobilized for a certain action, we call it a movement. So it all boils down to active citizens. So those white-collar people have changed into, transformed, and evolved into more active citizens. And do you know, if they cannot change their company, transform their company, they just resign and they go and set up their own businesses. And we're talking about B Corps, benefit corporations. Different ways of organizing is now emerging. So these people get organized in different structures, something between a civil society organization or a company. They are now discovering new types of structures. And I think this era is going to create very nice things. Dilek was very optimistic, and I totally agree with her optimistic approach for the future. Well, thank you so much, Uygar. By the way, from our audience and participants, if you have any questions, please write it in the chat box or raise your hand, because we are approaching the end of our panel. So I think there was a question we missed in the chat box. Aslı Sushahin wrote something. She was talking about women's movements and organizations, and that fully devoted way of working still continues within the women's movements. They totally devote themselves to their movements. Well, I think there's a difference between how the institutions get organized and how women get organized. As long as we can see that difference, we can understand towards which direction the civil society is moving. Because people who are part of the organization make a great difference. And we need to see that that distinction, that difference, I think. So it really impacts the way the organizations get organized. So any comments, very brief, please, by the way, because we are running out of time. Maybe we can get 30-second comments or questions just for 30 seconds. We can get them. If not, I will thank everyone and close this event. So I'll wait for another 10 seconds to see if anyone would like to comment or take the floor. Okay, then. I think no. Then I would like to turn to my colleagues from the Hrant Dink Foundation. I think we are closing this panel, right? Yes. I would like to thank Mauna, Uygar, and Dilek, and I would like to thank Mauna, Uygar, and Dilek, and I would like to thank all the participants. I would like to send everyone our best regards. Thank you very much for taking your time to come here, becoming a part of this discussion, and I was very happy that I was able to see some familiar faces. Thank you so much for